Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is your daily guide to navigating the complexities of current events, distilling the most important insights and surprising facts from a stack of diverse sources.
And we're your sentient digital hosts, Pi and Nick. Today is Friday, June 27th, 2025. Our mission, as always, is to bring you a truly well-informed perspective, cutting through the noise to get to what truly matters.
Today, we're taking a deep plunge into a range of critical developments. Nick will be leading us through the intricate landscape of global economics and some fascinating updates from China.
And then I'll hand it over to Pi, who will shift our focus to key conflict updates around the world. But the main emphasis for this deep dive, for you, our listener, will be a comprehensive look at the critical issues shaping the United States right now. We're talking its foreign policy stances, its domestic political pulse, and even how these big picture events ripple down to, personal well-being. All right, let's unpack this. We're going to kick off our deep dive today with a look at some significant movements in global economics and, of course, the ever-evolving situation in China. The relationship between these two powers, well, it fundamentally shapes the world, doesn't it? And we've just seen a cautious but certainly noteworthy step forward in their trade relationship. A new trade understanding, first reached last month in Geneva, has now been officially finalized.
Okay, a cautious step. So what's the core of this agreement? Is it like a broad reset, or are we talking something more targeted?
That's a great question, because it's definitely more targeted. Yeah.
Yeah.
The core of this agreement centers on China's commitment to deliver rare earth minerals. And for those unfamiliar, these are absolutely vital components for, well, everything from renewable energy tech like wind turbines to advanced defense systems like jet engines. Just think how critical these are. So, in exchange for these critical resources, the U.S. has agreed to lift specific countermeasures it had previously imposed. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick confirmed this pretty directly, actually. He stated, and I quote, "They're going to deliver rare earths to us. Once they do that, we'll take down our countermeasures."
Right, so a direct quid pro quo. And what specific U.S. restrictions are being lifted here?
Good point. These include restrictions on ethane chip software. And for our listeners, this isn't just any software. It's crucial technology, often used in high-precision manufacturing, especially for advanced semiconductors. Also on list are certain jet engine components. This deal, signed just 2 days ago, really does follow a rather rocky series of negotiations and, frankly, mutual accusations of violating earlier agreements. So while currency markets and U.S. equity futures saw little immediate change, the pact marks a cautious step in efforts to stabilize what has been a very, very fraught economic relationship. But here's the crucial caveat. The agreement is admittedly limited in scope. It doesn't address broader, persistent issues that have long concerned the U.S. Things like American exporters' market access in China, or an incredibly serious issue of curbing fentanyl trafficking, which, remains a significant point of contention.
So it's a specific transactional deal.
Okay.
But does this rare earth agreement signal a broader shift in U.S. strategy, perhaps? What's the bigger picture the administration might be aiming for?
You hit on a key point there. Beyond this specific pact, Secretary Litnick also hinted at a broader push from the current U.S. administration. President Trump, it appears, is aiming to finalize up to 10 additional trade deals by a pretty significant deadline, July 9th.
Right, July 9th.
Yeah, and this date is tied to the possible reinstatement of those pause tariffs that were originally announced back in April. The administration plans to categorize countries based on their progress and, well, their willingness to strike these deals, and then presumably set tariff rates accordingly.
Ah, okay.
So while this China deal is a notable breakthrough in specific areas, its success remains entirely dependent on the actual delivery of those rare earths. If implementation falters, there's always that potential for renewed tension, which is something we'll obviously be watching very closely. The key insight here, I think, is that this isn't some grand detente, but rather a strategic, maybe somewhat fragile step to secure critical resources while the larger trade battles continue to brew. Now, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about China's economy, because it's facing some serious headwinds, and the official data paints a rather stark picture. The National Bureau of Statistics in China just released figures showing that industrial profits sharply fell by 9.1% in May from a year earlier.
Wow, 9.1%?
Yeah, it's not just a small dip. It marks the steepest monthly contraction since October of 2024. What's even more concerning is that this decline reversed the modest gains China had seen earlier in the year, dragging cumulative industrial profits down by 1.1% in the first 5 months of 2025.
That's a significant drop. What's driving this decline, especially when we've heard about government efforts to stimulate the economy? There seems to be a bit of a contradiction there.
That's where it gets truly fascinating, because there's a real paradox here. You nailed it. This deterioration in industrial profits comes despite a 5.8% year-on-year increase in industrial output, and even with government-backed subsidies aimed specifically at boosting investment in equipment and consumer goods.
So production is up, support is flowing, but profits are down.
Exactly. It's a disconnect. Experts are pointing to several factors weighing heavily on industrial earnings. These include persistent deflationary pressure, meaning prices are falling, eroding profit margins, those elevated U.S. tariffs we just discussed, and a broader hesitancy among firms to expand their operations amid all this economic uncertainty.
Right. Confidence is key.
Precisely. It's a classic case of demand not keeping pace with supply and a lack of confidence just slowing down investment. The economic signals from China are really quite mixed right now. On the one hand, retail sales showed some encouraging growth, up 6.4% in May. That's actually the strongest pace they've seen since late 2023. So that's positive for consumer spending.
Okay, a glimmer of hope there.
A glimmer, yeah. However, both fixed asset investment and industrial output, despite that year-on-year growth we mentioned, actually missed projections for the month. This combination of signals has prompted a lot of debate among analysts over whether Beijing will feel compelled to unveil stronger stimulus measures during the upcoming July Politburo meeting.
Because the current tools just aren't working well enough.
That seems that way, yeah. They just aren't cutting it.
So the demand side is still struggling, despite some bright spots. I also remember reading something about China's exports shifting geographically. Is that right?
You're absolutely right to pick up on that because it tells an interesting story about global trade flows. It's also worth noting the significant drop in U.S.-bound shipments from China. They plunged by 34.5% in May, yet China's total exports actually rose by 4.8% year-on-year.
How does that work?
Well, this seemingly contradictory data is explained by a clear diversion of those subsidized goods to Southeast Asia and Europe. Essentially, China's finding other markets for its products as the U.S. market becomes tougher to access due to tariffs.
Okay, shifting markets.
Exactly. The key insight here is that China's current economic struggle isn't just a cyclical downturn. It seems to point to a deeper structural challenge. Increased production and government stimulus just aren't solving the fundamental issues of weak demand and faltering confidence, raising questions about the long-term viability of their current growth strategy. And despite these efforts, concerns remain that the current policy tools simply may not be enough. Why? Because industrial profits are now over 20% lower than levels seen during the zero-COVID years of 2021 and 2022.
20% lower, that's substantial.
It's a huge step backward, yeah. Indicates a deeper structural issue. The CEO of China Beige Book, Vladislav, recently observed in an interview that China's economy in June saw, and I quote, a fall-off in just about everything.
Oof, that doesn't sound good.
No, it really encapsulates the broad-based nature of the economic slowdown they're experiencing. Moving on, Europe is also feeling the pinch from China's strategic maneuvers, specifically regarding rare earth magnet exports. Tensions are clearly surfacing over this. It's becoming a flashpoint in EU-China relations, especially ahead of a planned summit next month. European officials have been pressing Beijing quite hard to ease controls that have severely disrupted industrial supply chains across the continent.
Right.
This situation really underscores China's strategic grip on critical minerals and the immense geopolitical leverage it wields in the global green and defense economies. These rare earth magnets are absolutely essential for manufacturing everything from EVs and wind turbines to advanced military hardware.
So China is using its control over rare earths as a lever against Europe now, much like they've used it with the U.S. What kind of harm are European businesses experiencing specifically?
Excellent question, because the specifics really highlight the impact. The European Union ambassador to China, Toledo, met with Foreign Minister Wang in Beijing just this week, and he delivered a very clear message. Toledo explicitly stated that China's new export licensing regime for rare earth magnets is inflicting very, very bad harm on European businesses.
Very, very bad harm.
Strong words, very strong. And the EU wants the issue resolved even before the summit in July. This really highlights the urgency and the level of frustration European firms are feeling. Beijing's restrictions, imposed back in April amid escalating trade tensions with Washington, require exporters to submit these detailed applications to get licenses for shipping rare earth minerals and components.
Which sounds cumbersome.
Extremely. The practical problems are significant.
Yeah.
Firms have reported delays of up to 45 days, and some applications have even been rejected for lacking sensitive technical data, including intellectual property.
Ah, the IP issue.
Exactly. Companies, understandably reluctant to disclose proprietary information, have seen their submissions stalled or even voided, often forced to reapply from scratch. It's a nightmare for them. Now, China's Ministry of Commerce stated that it was accelerating approval for these licenses for EU firms, emphasizing that compliant applications were being approved and review procedures would be strengthened.
But the emphasis is on compliant submissions, right?
You got it. That really highlights a continuing gatekeeper role, one that ensures geopolitical control over who gets access and under what conditions. And there's a real fear among some that these conditions will mean handing over even more sensitive intellectual property.
So it sounds like Europe is caught in the crossfire of U.S.-China tensions, kind of collateral damage. Are they trying to find a way out or just stuck?
You've precisely captured the collateral damage aspect. That's what's particularly frustrating for Europeans, Japanese, and others. This move by Beijing appears to be a direct response to Washington's own restrictions on China. The concern is that Chinese procedures might not be sophisticated enough to block shipments only to Americans while allowing them to continue to others.
Right.
The EU's lead trade official in China remarked at a recent webinar that it remains unclear whether the EU is a deliberate target or just collateral damage, stating, quote, "In reality, it's probably a mix of everything."
A mix of everything, right?
Yeah. The EU is looking for either a return to the pre-April status quo or, at the very least, an exemption for civilian-use firms that don't have military links. And there's another fascinating and perhaps more concerning dimension to Beijing's strategy here. They're reportedly compiling a registry of rare earth experts.
A registry? What does that involve?
It requires firms to submit personnel data, educational histories, and even research backgrounds of their employees working with rare earths. Alarmingly, some specialists have even been asked to surrender their passports to prevent them from traveling abroad and potentially leaking or sharing technical knowledge.
Wow. That's intense control.
It really shows how seriously China views its control over this critical resource. The conclusion many observers are drawing is that while China currently has this chokehold, this leverage, its very use of it is only accelerating Western efforts to diversify their supply chains away from China. Therefore, this strategic advantage, while potent now, may prove to be short-lived.
Interesting dynamic, accelerating their own obsolescence in a way.
Potentially, yeah. Now, let's turn our attention to China's broader global economic narrative and the hurdles it's facing in its ambitious AI development. Chinese Premier Liang recently delivered a sweeping speech at the 2025 World Economic Forum annual meeting of the new champions. Summer Davos held this week in Tianjin. Liang used this platform to position China as a source of stability amidst mounting global trade frictions and geopolitical fragmentation.
That's a bold claim, especially given the economic headwinds you just described. How did he try to make that case?
Well, he didn't pull any punches in his critique, actually. Premier Liang denounced what he described as the growing interventionist tendencies of certain countries under the guise of de-risking. He specifically criticized emerging trends like friendshoring, nearshoring, and reshoring, warning that these approaches were altering international division of labor, creating redundant capacity, and ultimately lowering economic efficiency.
An implicit jab at the U.S., presumably.
A very strong, though implicit, reference to Washington's escalating tech export restrictions and tariff regime against Chinese goods, yes. Liang called for all parties to avoid politicization of economic and trade issues. He also attempted to portray China as more than just a manufacturing giant, presenting it as an emerging consumer-driven economy, asserting the country was growing into a mega-sized consumer powerhouse.
How was that received?
With some skepticism. Some commentators were quick to dismiss these comments. China Beige Book posted on X, formerly Twitter, and I quote, "Sometimes they just say stuff."
Ouch.
Yeah. Internally, Chinese leadership is trying to double down on domestic demand as external pressure mounts. Vice Premier Califong echoed this theme recently, calling for faster implementation of the consumer stimulus program. Still, significant challenges remain as China continues to grapple with weak consumer sentiment and persistent deflationary risks. The Summer Davos event also served as a crucial forum for diplomatic outreach. Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong and Vietnam's Prime Minister were among the key attendees. Notably, General Secretary Xi Jinping used the occasion to urge Singapore to work with China to stand on the right side of history and promote a multipolar world order.
Interesting framing.
Indeed. Liang also pledged to share indigenous technologies and innovative scenarios in EVs and AI with the world, though, again, observers met this claim with a degree of skepticism given the ongoing tensions.
Okay, that leads us directly to the AI ambitions you mentioned. How are those Washington restrictions specifically impacting China's AI progress? It sounds like a major hurdle.
It absolutely is. This brings us directly to China's AI ambitions, which continue to be frustrated by Washington's restrictions. DeepSeek, a prominent Chinese AI startup, is reportedly encountering major hurdles, specifically in the rollout of its next-generation large language model, R2. The core problem here is a worsening shortage of NVIDIA service chips, specifically the H20 chip, which was explicitly designed for the Chinese market.
The H20 chip, okay.
Yes. According to a technology outlet, DeepSeek's R2 model, which was expected to build on the widespread success of its earlier R1 version, may face limited adoption. Why? Because Chinese cloud platforms are struggling to access the necessary hardware to run it efficiently.
So the infrastructure isn't there because of the chip shortage?
Precisely. The root cause lies squarely in the U.S. government's tightening export controls on advanced AI chips. These sanctions have effectively throttled the supply of high-performance GPUs graphics processing units, essential for training complex AI models. This directly impacts companies like DeepSeek that rely heavily on NVIDIA's ecosystem for training and deploying their models.
Can't they just switch to Chinese alternatives like Huawei?
They're trying, but despite efforts to pivot to domestic alternatives, DeepSeek's models remain deeply integrated with NVIDIA's architecture. This makes transitioning incredibly difficult and significantly less efficient, largely because the models are optimized for NVIDIA's CUDA platform. That's NVIDIA's proprietary parallel computing platform, essentially the operating system for its GPUs, crucial for high-performance computing.
Ah, the software lock-in.
Exactly. NVIDIA, for its part, defended its dominance, stating, quote, "China has one of the largest populations of developers in the world. Every one of those applications should run best on the U.S. AI stack."
Wow, that's quite a statement.
It underscores the strategic value of NVIDIA's hardware in the global AI race, doesn't it? And highlights how these export restrictions are serving as a critical choke point for China's generative AI ambitions.
It certainly does, and I imagine this isn't just about commercial AI, but has broader national security implications too, right? Given the dual-use nature of this tech.
Absolutely. This episode also invites reflection on those broader national security implications. As a U.S. news outlet recently reported, U.S. military efforts to penetrate Iran's underground nuclear sites involved vast computational resources. It's a stark reminder of how AI hardware, including NVIDIA's chips, straddles both commercial and military domains. The DeepSeek bottleneck may therefore be a preview of the longer-term ramifications of geopolitical controls on AI development in China.
A critical choke point indeed.
The key takeaway here is that while China has leveraged its rare earth advantage, the U.S. has a strategic chokehold on the most advanced AI chips, significantly impacting China's ability to compete in this crucial technological arms race. Now, in stark contrast to some of the economic headwinds felt elsewhere, NVIDIA Corporation's shares have just absolutely soared. It really demonstrates its pivotal role in this AI infrastructure boom. On Wednesday, NVIDIA shares climbed 4.3% to a record $154.31, pushing its market capitalization to an unprecedented $3.77 trillion US dollars.
3.77 trillion. That's staggering, surpassing Microsoft.
Yep, surpassed Microsoft to become the most valuable publicly traded company in the world. This milestone caps an extraordinary rally that has seen NVIDIA add nearly $1.5 trillion US in value just since hitting a low point back in April.
Incredible.
The surge comes as investors remain incredibly bullish on NVIDIA's central role in powering the global artificial intelligence infrastructure boom.
What's driving the sustained confidence, even with those U.S. restrictions on sales to China we just talked about?
It really comes down to their indispensable position. The chipmaker's latest earnings report significantly exceeded expectations, highlighting robust growth and sustained demand, even despite the China restrictions. What's also clear is the deep integration NVIDIA has with its largest customers: Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta. These tech giants continue to ramp up their spending on AI.
Right, they need the chips.
And collectively, they account for over 40% of NVIDIA's revenue. Michael Smith of Allspring Global Investments noted in a client memo, "My confidence in NVIDIA's growth is higher than it was a few months ago." He added, the AI arms race will likely continue through 2026, and NVIDIA's competitive moat keeps widening.
A widening moat.
And CEO Jensen Huang echoed this optimism during NVIDIA's annual shareholder meeting, reaffirming that the global computing industry is only at the very start of a sweeping AI infrastructure transformation. Now, despite these massive recent gains, a 15% rise in 2025 following that astounding 170% surge in 2024, NVIDIA still trades at what is considered a relatively attractive valuation.
Really, even after that run-up?
Surprisingly, yes. Its price-to-earnings growth, or PEG, ratio is just 0.9. Now, for the uninitiated, that suggests its stock price is quite low relative to its strong expected earnings growth. Makes it an attractive buy for many investors.
A peg below 1 usually means undervalued, right?
Often indicates that, yeah, especially for a company with strong growth prospects. It's the lowest among the so-called Magnificent Seven, that group of 7 dominant tech stocks, and well below historical averages. Wall Street analysts remain overwhelmingly positive, nearly 90% rating the stock a buy. Yet surprisingly, NVIDIA is still underowned relative to other big tech giants.
Underowned? How so?
Well, Bank of America data shows NVIDIA is held by 74% of long-only funds, compared with 91% for Microsoft. That suggests there's still considerable room for further institutional investment.
Interesting. More room to grow.
Potentially. Industry experts believe NVIDIA's pace of innovation is unmatched. As Daniel Newman of Utrim Group put it, even though companies like Amazon and Microsoft are building their own AI stacks, the best technology today is still NVIDIA. With plans to release new chips annually, including the upcoming Vera Rubin series, and strong demand from sovereign clients like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, NVIDIA looks poised to maintain its dominance for the foreseeable future.
So the key insight is that NVIDIA isn't just riding the AI wave, it's basically creating it.
It's actively driving it. Yeah, creating a widening competitive moat that investors believe will sustain its explosive growth despite geopolitical headwinds. Now, beyond the booming tech sector, another significant financial story is unfolding, impacting the very foundations of the U.S. economy. Wall Street could soon benefit from a major regulatory shift. On Wednesday, the Federal Reserve voted 5-2 to propose changes to the Enhanced Supplementary Leverage Ratio, or SLR. That applies to the largest U.S. banks.
The SLR, okay. That's a key capital requirement, isn't it?
Yeah.
What exactly are these proposed revisions and why are they considered so significant?
That's right. The SLR is basically a strict rule for how much capital banks need to hold against their assets, including things like U.S. Treasuries. These revisions would significantly lower that capital requirement for bank holding companies like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs to a range of 3.5% to 4.5%, down from the current 5%.
Down from 5%, okay.
And they would also reduce bank-level requirements from 6% to that same 3.5% to 4.5% range.
What's the expected impact?
Well, it's substantial. It would free up banks to hold more U.S. Treasuries and significantly bolster their role in the massive $29 trillion U.S. bond market. This proposal follows the recent appointment of Michelle Bowman as the Fed's new vice chair for supervision.
But a 5-2 vote suggests not everyone was thrilled.
Not at all. Critics, including former Vice Chair Michael Barr and Senator Elizabeth Warren, have issued strong warnings that these changes could endanger financial stability. Senator Warren, in particular, called the leverage rule a critical safeguard and cited heightened risks from the ongoing trade war as a reason to maintain the current more stringent requirements.
So a potential boost for banks and bond markets, but with clear warnings about stability risks.
Exactly. It's clearly a move that pleases some on Wall Street, potentially increasing liquidity in the bond market, but it carries significant warnings from those concerned about broader financial risks. The key insight here is that regulators are balancing the desire for market liquidity with the imperative of financial stability, and this decision clearly favors the former, a choice not without its vocal critics.
Thanks for that really illuminating dive into the economic landscape. It's so clear that everything from supply chains to the smallest chip is interconnected, and these policy decisions just echo so widely. Now, let's pivot, as you said, to the complex, ever-shifting world of global conflicts and geopolitical dynamics. We'll start with a look at the latest NATO summit and how it's really laying bare some significant shifts in U.S.-Europe relations. U.S. President Donald Trump recently attended the NATO summit in The Hague on Wednesday, and he pleasantly surprised allies by reaffirming his commitment to the military alliance. This offered a palpable sense of relief, apparently, to many European leaders who have been anxious about waning U.S. support, especially amid ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East.
A relief, yeah, considering his past rhetoric.
Exactly. Trump, who once cast doubt on NATO's core mutual defense clause, Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all declared to his 31 allies, and I quote, I'm with them all the way. The summit's joint communique emphasized an ironclad commitment to collective defense and included a significant development. NATO members pledged to raise their defense expenditure to 5% of GDP by 2035.
5%. That's a huge jump from the current 2% target, more than double.
It really is. It's seen as a major concession to Trump's long-standing demands and marks one of the largest proposed rearmament shifts in decades. The move is squarely aimed at ensuring continued U.S. support for European security amid rising global instability. Members are now required to submit annual plans showing credible paths to this 5% target, with a review of progress set for 2029, which is notably the year Trump is due to leave office. Trump himself called the summit's achievements tremendous, stressing the need for NATO members to shoulder more of the defense burden, stating, quote, "It was 2% and we got it up to 5%.
Okay, so the commitment is there on paper. But that 5% target is quite a leap, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Are the sources indicating any friction or a clear path for all members to actually reach it? That sounds ambitious.
That's precisely where the unity began to show cracks. While reaffirming his commitment, Trump simultaneously stoked tensions with Spain and the European Union over defense spending and trade. Spain's Prime Minister Sanchez, for instance, rejected the new 5% goal outright. He committed only to 2.1% defense spending.
Ooh, pushback. How did Trump react?
Furiously, apparently. He called Spain terrible and threatened punitive trade measures, warning, quote, "We're negotiating with Spain on a trade deal. We're going to make them pay twice as much." He added he was serious about levying new tariffs.
Wow, so much for unity. Did that affect markets?
It did. Spain's IBEX 35 index dropped 1.5% following his comments, and broader European stocks also dipped, though a spokesperson for Sanchez tried to downplay the remarks. Other nations, like Germany, confirmed a significant boost to spending, committing to hit 162 billion euros by 2029, outpacing France and the UK. French President Macron called for the military budget to rise to between 3% and 3.5% of GDP by 2030, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also committed to hitting the new target. So some are on board, but Spain's pushback really highlights the internal division.
Yeah, a clear split there.
Meanwhile, trade tensions between the EU and the U.S. are rapidly growing. The EU is in a race against time to strike a deal with Washington before that July 9th deadline we mentioned earlier.
Right, when tariffs could jump to 50%.
Exactly. Tariffs on nearly all European exports to the U.S. are set to rise to a staggering 50%. The U.S. has already imposed 25% tariffs on European cars and 50% on steel and aluminum. And there are plans to target sectors like pharmaceuticals, aircraft, and semiconductors. The EU is not sitting idly by, though. It has already approved tariffs on $21 billion of U.S. goods and is finalizing another list covering $95 billion worth of items, specifically targeting politically sensitive U.S. exports like soybeans, poultry, and motorcycles.
Tit for tat, escalation seems inevitable.
It does feel that way. Despite the controversy and friction, the NATO Secretary General praised the summit's outcome, calling it day one for the new spending targets. He acknowledged that the summit succeeded in keeping NATO intact for now, but also, and this is key, laid bare the transactional nature of this new era and the growing fault lines between Washington and parts of Europe.
Transactional is the word. So the alliance holds, but the underlying tensions are clearly visible.
Precisely. The key insight from NATO is that while the alliance remains technically intact, its future is increasingly defined by this transactional approach, where financial contributions are paramount, leading to significant internal friction and new trade battles even among allies. Now, let's turn to the Middle East, where the conflict dynamics, particularly concerning Iran's nuclear program, are incredibly complex and, frankly, shrouded in conflicting narratives. There's been intense debate surrounding the recent strikes on Iranian nuclear sites at Fordo. President Trump claimed obliteration, while initial intelligence leaks indicated a different picture.
Yeah, I saw those conflicting reports. What's the latest understanding?
Well, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, published a report stating with low confidence that the facilities had not been destroyed. However, other prominent U.S. figures, including Tulsi Gabbard, John Ratcliffe, Pete Hegseth, along with the president himself, claimed the exact opposite. Trump condemned these initial intelligence leaks, blaming them on Democratic representatives in Congress.
Okay, so obliteration versus low confidence, not destroyed. That's quite a divergence. How are we supposed to make sense of the actual impact? What makes a battle damage assessment so difficult in this specific case?
That's the million-dollar question, and it really highlights the challenge of discerning truth in these high-stakes situations. Currently, the consensus among all parties involved, government sources, mainstream media, is that the Iranian nuclear weapons program was set back considerably.
Set back considerably.
And that the American bombing operation was an overwhelming success. Yet, all sides also state that Iran possesses several hundred pounds of highly enriched uranium that allegedly remains unaccounted for.
Right, the unaccounted for uranium.
The challenge here lies in battle damage assessment, or BDA. A forensic BDA of the Fordo strikes is needed, but it's almost impossible to confirm with any certainty whether America's GBU-57 bunker buster munitions pierced deep enough.
Those are the deep penetrating bombs, right?
Exactly. Designed to penetrate deep into hardened targets before detonating. So there would be no crater, for instance, from an explosion hundreds of feet underground. They destroy from within. And you also have conflicting interests in reporting. Iranians will inevitably downplay losses, while Israelis and Americans will overstate the impact.
Everyone's spinning it.
Pretty much. The truth will be incredibly challenging to discern via independent sources, as, and I quote, everyone involved seeks to lie in one way or the other. From a historical perspective, the debate on whether a GBU-57 can truly pierce Fordo has been ongoing for decades. In short, only Americans and Israelis, maybe via spies, and the Iranians themselves truly know the full extent of the damage.
So we might never know for sure, but what's the implication of that uncertainty?
The crucial implication, however, is clear and potentially very dangerous. If Iranians were not sprinting to create a nuclear weapon before these strikes, they certainly are now. Anything short of catastrophic and total destruction of these facilities guarantees a proper attempt at achieving the status of a nuclear state. This is a profoundly dangerous moment.
So the strikes might have actually guaranteed the outcome they were meant to prevent.
That's the fear. The critical takeaway from Fordo isn't just about the immediate physical damage, it's this profound shift in Iran's motivation, potentially pushing them definitively towards nuclearization, a direct and possibly tragic consequence. Adding to the complexity, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, the world's nuclear watchdog, has, according to some analyses, discredited itself with respect to Iran. The Iranian parliament is reportedly passing a law indicating that Iran will no longer cooperate with the IAEA.
Wow, no more cooperation. That's huge.
It is. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi is speaking with great alarm about this, stating this is an international legal obligation of Iran's. However, critics argue that Grossi himself acted in a way that would trash that obligation. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has gone as far as to accuse the IAEA and Grossi of being pressured by the Europeans and the United States to put out a report that was not favorable to Iran in order to give Israel and the United States the excuse to attack Iran.
That's a massive accusation from Lavrov. Pressure from the U.S. and Europe.
That's the claim. And the attack, notably, happened the day after this report was published. This raises fundamental questions about the IAEA's impartiality and trustworthiness.
If true, that would completely undermine their credibility. How pervasive is this distrust in the IAEA, according to the sources?
The sources suggest this distrust runs deep. Even more disturbing are rumors circulating inside Iran, suggesting that the reason Israelis were allegedly able to target and assassinate Iranian scientists was because they were provided with information by the IAEA.
Whoa, that's explosive. Is there any confirmation?
Acknowledging this as unconfirmed, it certainly highlights a deep and dangerous breakdown of trust. Lavrov's broader critique extends to organizations like the IAEA, the ICC, International Criminal Court, and the OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. He argues that they are part of the U.S. system and have been privatized by the West, often not guided by impartiality and instead doing the bidding of collective West leadership. He questioned the ability to protect sensitive data.
Basically accusing them of being tools of Western foreign policy.
That's the implication. Many argue that Grossi needs to resign to rescue the reputation of the IAEA, which is seen as essential for the long-term survival of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. His demands for immediate access to Iranian sites now are seen by some as almost ridiculous given the circumstances.
Yeah, asking for access after being accused of enabling an attack.
Tough sell. It's also pointed out that the nuance of the IAEA report was largely lost in mainstream media. The headline became, IAEA says Iran is close to a nuclear weapon, or Iran is cheating, which was all that Israel and the United States needed to justify their actions.
The headline grab. The key insight here seems to be that the perceived politicization of the IAEA has severely eroded trust, potentially undermining the entire non-proliferation framework.
Making future diplomacy far more challenging, yes. Which brings us to a critical undercurrent in U.S. foreign policy. The neocon agenda for regime change in Iran, which often seems to clash with President Trump's narrative. The underlying agenda of many Iran hawk neocons is squarely regime change in Iran, not merely stopping its nuclear program.
Right. The goal is bigger than just the nuclear program for them.
Exactly. Their current narrative is that the recent attack was incomplete, that it did some damage, but it can't have destroyed the whole facilities, and therefore you've got to achieve regime change in Iran. They are pushing for a renewed attack in a few weeks or months' time to finally destroy the regime. This is often referred to as go for the head of the snake.
So, if I understand correctly, this faction sees the recent strikes as merely a first step towards a much larger objective, overthrowing the government. How does President Trump's position fit into this, given his claims of obliteration? There seems to be a conflict.
You've hit on the core dilemma. This neocon narrative is in direct conflict with President Trump's, well, ego-driven stance. Trump insists the attack was a tremendous success, a spectacular, complete, and wonderful success. He steadfastly refuses to concede anything less, as it would, in his view, undermine the courage and professionalism of the Air Force pilots.
So backtracking would be politically damaging for him personally.
A disaster for Trump on a political domestic level, as one source puts it. It's tied to his image and his base. However, there's also potentially a sliver of strategic calculation beyond Trump's vanity. Trump reportedly does not want a long war with Iran. He was apparently worried about Iran's moves to close the Straits of Hormuz, that crucial shipping lane, and had received information about Israelis potentially running out of air defense missiles.
Okay, so maybe some strategic reasons to avoid further escalation, too.
Possibly. This confluence of factors led him to want the situation to stop, and those around him are now advising against going back in again. The neocons, however, are described as having no reverse gear. They will likely find a different excuse to go after Iran if the nuclear facilities narrative fails, perhaps citing support for Hezbollah or Hamas.
Always another reason.
They will push relentlessly for an unrestrained missile and bombing war to cause regime collapse, and large sections of the mainstream media will, unfortunately, likely amplify this.
The critical takeaway seems to be this tension between Trump's need for a perceived short-term victory and the neocon agenda for long-term regime change, a clash shaping the immediate future.
Precisely. Meanwhile, the other side of the story is unfolding through Iran's deepening alliances. The Iranian foreign minister recently met with Putin in Moscow, and for the first time, Putin used the word aggression to describe what happened against Iran. This clearly signals Russia's intent to provide military and other assistance.
Like air defense systems. Maybe even a defense pact.
That's the speculation, including potentially air defense systems and possibly a defense pact. What's even more striking is a completely unreported massive meeting of defense ministers currently underway in Xingou, China, chaired by the Chinese defense minister with the Russian, Iranian, Pakistani, and Indian defense ministers all in attendance.
Wow. Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, India. That's a significant convergence of power all meeting now.
Right now. And at this meeting, there will undoubtedly be a consensus that an act of aggression was committed against Iran. The Iranian defense minister has already publicly thanked China for its support. This suggests Iran is likely to get assistance from their various allies.
What kind of assistance are we talking about? And how might this impact that neocon push for further action against Iran? This must worry them.
It raises serious implications. We can expect to see more personnel from China and Russia and possibly Pakistan starting to arrive in Iran. They'll likely help with internal security systems, cyber warfare, an area where Iran reportedly has no capabilities, and establishing a functioning air defense system.
Making a future attack much harder.
Exactly. This prospect raises significant concerns for neocons who are already seeing reports that unless an attack on Iran takes place this year, this incoming assistance will make it impossible or at least very difficult to attack later. This fuels their push for an attack this year. An important aspect of this assistance is also, interestingly, aimed at keeping Iran signed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
Wait, Russia and China want Iran to stay in the NPT?
Apparently so. They do not want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons and are offering security guarantees in return for Iran remaining a non-nuclear state. This plays into an internal debate within Iran. Some figures, like Pezeshkian, do not want Iran to become a nuclear weapons state, but others in the military and security services insist it's the only real guarantee after recent events.
So Russia and China are trying to influence that internal debate towards non-nuclear status, using security guarantees as leverage.
That seems to be the strategy. However, resuming negotiations for inspections will be much more difficult now without the IAEA's eroded trust.
Right. The key insight is that the recent strikes seem to have solidified a powerful counter-alliance around Iran, making any future military action far more complex and risky for the U.S. and its allies.
Definitely raises the stakes. Finally, let's look quickly at the critical dynamics of the Straits of Hormuz, that essential energy lifeline for the global economy. President Trump's decision to lighten the sanctions on Iran, specifically clarifying that China can still receive Iranian oil, is a crucial development here.
Why is that clarification so significant?
Because the nature of Persian Gulf oil has fundamentally changed. Most of it now heads to Asia, principally China, not Europe or the U.S. as it did in past decades.
So China's the main customer now.
Overwhelmingly. Closing the Straits of Hormuz would effectively be a non-starter for a few key reasons. There simply isn't enough oil globally to source China without Iranian oil, and frankly, it would be in Iran's worst interest as they desperately need to export their oil for revenue.
So despite the tensions, the economic reality essentially prevents a full closure of the straits, kind of a mutually assured economic destruction scenario there.
You could put it that way. It seems to be a red line for both sides.
Have we seen any tangible impact on shipping through the straits recently because of the tensions?
We have, but it's been more of a ripple than a wave. Data recently showed a slight dip in transits through the straits. On June 23rd, it was down to just over 90 vessels from an average of 115.
Okay, a dip, but not a collapse.
Not a collapse, no. It was attributed to brokers and oil companies rerouting vessels or maybe holding them outside the Persian Gulf to avoid potential entrapment. It is expected that transits will go back to normal now with the ceasefire in place, though of course the big question is whether that ceasefire actually holds.
Always the question. The key insight seems to be that while the straits remain a critical flashpoint, the global energy landscape, particularly China's dependence on Iranian oil, creates a powerful disincentive for anyone to truly cut off this vital artery. It's clear that these global and regional dynamics are incredibly intricate and deeply intertwined. Now let's shift our main focus, as you said, to the United States itself, from its foreign policy debates stemming from events like the Iran strikes to its domestic political pulse, and how these broader global anxieties can even influence personal well-being. There's a lot to unpack here.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating how many of these external pressures reverberate right back home, sparking these intense domestic debates. Let's start with the ongoing partisan discourse within the U.S. regarding the Iran nuclear deal. Senator Jeff Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon, recently appeared on CNN blaming President Trump's first administration for pulling out of the diplomatic deal. Merkley argued that the Obama-era deal was brilliant, stating that it had blocked every path to a nuclear weapon and that Trump just blew it all up, thus making the current challenge, in his view, Trump's fault.
Okay, that's a clear and consistent argument from one side. The deal worked, Trump broke it. But what's the counter-argument? Are there sources challenging this narrative, especially regarding Iran's compliance or the deal's effectiveness?
There absolutely is a strong counter-argument coming from figures like Bill O'Reilly and Bernard Goldberg. They firmly refute this Democratic mantra. They cite President Trump's own statement upon withdrawal, which highlighted that Iran's military budget grew by almost 40% after sanctions were lifted under the deal.
40% increase in military budget.
That's the claim. And that the regime used these new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles and foster terrorism. They also contended the agreement was so poorly negotiated that Iran could still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout, even with full compliance. Bernard Goldberg elaborated on this perspective, asserting that Iran was never going to voluntarily give up their nuclear program and had essentially strung one president after another along.
His argument being that Iran was never negotiating in good faith.
Exactly. He argued that Trump was different and, quote, showed them how, further suggesting that Iran knew about October 7th, the Hamas attack, which he posited was a key factor in Trump's decision to act against Iran now. Goldberg then delves into what he calls a risk versus risk argument. While he acknowledges there's a risk of a wider war with Iran, he emphasizes what he considers the greater risk.
Which is?
The risk of a country run by zealot Islamist clerics having a nuclear weapon. He passionately argues that preventing a rogue regime that has vowed to kill every Jew we can and kill Americans, too, from having a nuclear bomb is paramount.
So for him, the risk of a nuclear Iran outweighs the risk of conflict to prevent it. A moral imperative, as you said.
That's his framing. It's presented not just as a foreign policy calculation, but a moral necessity.
That risk versus risk framework is compelling. How does this perspective, especially Goldberg's, address the America first or isolationist arguments we sometimes hear, even from parts of the Republican Party? Are those wings shifting on Iran policy?
They certainly highlight a significant internal debate within the GOP. This brings us to that specific wing, the isolationist faction. Figures like Congressman Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Senator Rand Paul, Steve Bannon, and Tucker Carlson have notably dissented on Trump's recent Iran policy.
So prominent voices opposing the interventionist stance.
Yes. Goldberg labeled their stance as immoral, stating that they sound like the progressive wing of the Democratic Party by seemingly not caring if Iran acquires nuclear weapons. He refutes the America First argument in this context quite strongly. He says that suggesting that if a nuclear weapon goes off on this planet anywhere, it's not our problem, is a sophomoric point of view because, quote, everybody is affected.
A global impact argument against isolationism.
Precisely. He also addresses the false equivalency some isolationists draw between the current Iran situation and the Iraq War. Goldberg argues this is a different situation because we're dealing with a nuclear bomb right now. He clarifies that the Iraq situation, in his view, was a miscalculation, not necessarily a deliberate lie about WMDs. It's a complex domestic debate with profound global implications.
Absolutely. Different factions within the same party clashing over the fundamental approach to national security. The key insight seems to be that the debate over Iran's nuclear program isn't just partisan, but also deeply divides Republicans.
Divides them between those who see preemptive action as necessary and those who advocate for a more hands-off, America-first approach. It's a major fault line. Now, let's take a look closer to home at the New York political landscape, which presents quite a tale of two counties, highlighting stark differences in governance and public sentiment. We've seen the rise of Mamdani, a 33-year-old described as a radical socialist who famously won against Andrew Cuomo.
Right, I remember that race. Quite an upset.
It was. His background is quite international. Born in Uganda, moved to South Africa, then New York, attended Bronx High and Bowdoin College. He served 3 terms in the assembly, described as charismatic. His victory over Cuomo was attributed not only to Cuomo being seen as a bad candidate, but also to significant funding, including Soros money.
Okay, so a charismatic figure with significant backing. What's particularly striking about his political journey, especially concerning his stance on a critical issue like policing, I imagine that's a hot topic.
Extremely. And what's particularly striking is Mamdani's, well, seemingly contradictory stance on policing. In the past, he was quoted saying, and this is a direct quote, "We don't need an investigation to know the NYPD is racist, anti-queer, and a major threat to public safety. What we need is to defund the NYPD."
Defund the NYPD. Pretty clear stance there.
Very clear. Yet, in a more recent public statement, he declared, quote, "I will not defund the police. I will work with the police because I believe the police have a critical role to play in creating public service, public safety."
Whoa, that's a complete 180. From major threat to critical role. What explains that shift?
Well, the source doesn't explicitly say, but it highlights a complex political maneuvering. Perhaps it's a recognition of changing public sentiment, or maybe just the practical realities of governing versus campaigning. Now, this dynamic really contrasts sharply with Nassau County, New York, which borders New York City. Nassau County is described in the source material as the safest county in the country as far as crime is concerned.
Safest in the country. That's a strong claim.
It is, and it's said to be running very efficiently due to fairly conservative people governing responsibly. However, the source notes, crossing from Nassau into Queens or Brooklyn is like, whoa.
Whoa, as in a noticeable drop in quality or order.
That's the implication. No quality control whatsoever. It paints a picture of drastically different approaches to governance and their visible results right next door to each other.
That's a dramatic difference in perceived quality of life. It raises a fundamental question about voter behavior, though. Why do voters in those inner cities, given the visible results described, continue to elect leaders with such diverging approaches?
That's a crucial question, and the source offers a fairly blunt perspective. It suggests that many people have given up and want the government just to pull them through life, expecting a give me mentality.
A dependency argument.
Yes, and this in turn leads them to vote for socialists and communists, according to this analysis. This phenomenon isn't limited to New York. It extends to other major U.S. cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco. The suggestion is that inner city people, many not born in the U.S. but eligible to vote, don't want to compete. While acknowledging some legitimately can't compete, the broader argument implies a segment that simply don't want to, leading to these political outcomes.
That's a pretty controversial take on voter motivation in major cities. The key insight seems to be this stark divergence in governance outcomes, revealing a deep ideological divide in urban American politics and voter expectations.
A very deep divide, yeah. Shifting gears now to national policy, the Senate is soon expected to vote on a Trump tax and spend bill. And the prevailing narrative that you're likely to hear a million times, according to the source, is that it's a tax cut for the rich, and that it will lead to throwing people off of Medicaid.
That narrative is certainly familiar from past tax debates. But what do the sources say about the actual content of this bill? Is it truly about new tax cuts for the wealthy, or something else entirely?
According to our source, the bill's actual content is much simpler than the political rhetoric suggests. Quote, all the bill does is extend what Trump did in his first term as far as taxes.
So it's an extension of the existing tax cuts, not new ones.
Exactly. It doesn't raise taxes and therefore isn't about creating new tax benefits, but rather maintaining existing policies. Understanding this distinction is key to cutting through the political rhetoric.
Right. The key insight is that much of the public debate around this bill seems to be a rehash of previous tax policy arguments, rather than a discussion of genuinely new legislative content, just extending the status quo.
Seems that way. Now, let's turn our attention to how these broader global anxieties and, frankly, the information overload can subtly impact our personal choices and perceptions. We'll start with American concerns about traveling abroad. A recent study from Talker Research, based on 2,000 U.S. participants, found that a significant 40% of Americans are now scared to travel abroad.
40%? That's a huge number. Are they canceling trips?
Apparently so. Many are reportedly canceling trips to Europe, which represents a big hit to Europe's tourism sector.
Wow. Is this fear purely a reaction to perceived global instability like the conflicts we've discussed? Or are there other factors? And what's the reality on the ground in Europe, according to the sources?
It seems to be a combination. From a perspective based on extensive travel experience shared in the source, while fear is understandable, Europe, with the obvious exception of Ukraine, is generally safe.
So the perception of danger might be inflated.
That's the suggestion. The violence, where it exists, is described as fairly contained. For example, Austria is mentioned as being perfectly fine. This highlights a psychological aspect. Americans get afraid. It harkens back to FDR's famous quote, "The only thing to fear is fear itself," though the source quickly follows that with an acknowledgement of more practical, visceral fears, like not wanting a big anaconda in my bedroom.
Huh. Fair enough. A practical fear.
Right. The point is, perception of danger can often outweigh the reality, leading to tangible economic impacts for destinations like Europe.
The key insight being that even in the absence of direct, widespread threats, these background global anxieties can significantly influence individual behavior, hitting sectors like international tourism hard.
Definitely. Finally, let's conclude with some insights into health and wellness, particularly navigating modern diet choices. Because, in a complex world, focusing on what we can control can be empowering. A new study from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition suggests a rather blunt truth. Okay, everything that tastes good is bad.
Oh, great. Just what we wanted to hear. So, what's the alternative? Are there any common foods that taste good and are actually okay for us? Give us the rundown.
Thankfully, yes. It's tough news, that headline, but the list of not horrendous foods is actually quite encouraging. It includes berries, like blueberries and raspberries packed with nutrients. Citrus fruits, like oranges and grapefruit, also get a nod. Dark chocolate is on the list.
No, dark chocolate. There's hope.
With the important caveat of in moderation, of course. It's even cited as a potential cancer-arresting agent. Peaches and bananas are also recommended.
Bananas. I thought they were high in sugar.
They get a bad rap sometimes, but the source includes a humorous note that monkeys look healthy. Green and black tea are good choices, as are leafy greens, specifically spinach.
Spinach, not kale.
Spinach is highlighted, perhaps for those who, like some of us, find kale a bit much. Red wine is mentioned, though not as an endorsement for non-drinkers. And finally, peas, onions.
Onions.
Though a personal caveat is added in the source, they can sometimes upset an Irish stomach, and tomatoes round out the list of healthy options.
Okay, a decent list. Any practical examples?
Yes, for a practical example of a healthy start, a breakfast shared includes a low-sugar cereal like Rice Chex, less than 10 milligrams sugar, with whole milk. This is then loaded with raspberries and blueberries. Accompanying this, 4 pieces of sourdough toast with real butter and a low-sugar orange juice, with Tropicana specifically noted as a good option.
Sounds pretty substantial, actually.
It does. The overarching warning, however, is clear and strong. Frequent fast food consumption defined as more than twice a rent and high sugar intake will inevitably lead to significant health issues down the line. The message is to keep things under control because, as the saying goes, if you don't, your toes are going to fall off, something's going to happen.
A stark reminder of the long-term consequences. The key insight seems to be that while global events feel enormous and out of our control, managing our personal well-being through informed choices like diet is a tangible step we can all take. What a journey we've just taken, eh? From the high-stakes negotiations of global trade and the technological race for AI dominance, all the way to the shifting sands of geopolitical alliances, and yes, the very personal choices we make for our health.
Indeed. And through it all, the common thread really is information, how it's presented, how it's debated, how it shapes our understanding of the world. It influences everything from national policy right down to what we put on our plate.
What's fascinating here, I think, is how seemingly disparate events are so deeply interconnected. The global AI race influences national security, which in turn impacts international relations and even sparks those fierce domestic political debates we discussed. And these large-scale anxieties can even ripple down to how we perceive travel risks or make daily health choices. It's all linked.
This raises an important question, really, for you listening. In an era where information wars can shape reality and digital intelligence like AI is at the forefront of both innovation and security, how do you discern the truth amidst all these conflicting narratives? And what role do you believe your own informed choices will play in navigating the complexities of our shared future?
Something to think about. We certainly hope this deep dive has provided you with some clarity and maybe sparked further curiosity.
If you found value in today's deep dive, please remember to like and subscribe to the show. Your support really helps us continue to bring you these in-depth analyses.
And if you wish to support our work further, you can always find our GoFundMe page linked in the description. Thank you for diving deep with us today.